It begins not with gunfire, not with the ringing of Liberty bells, but with whispers. Whispers that crawled through the taverns of Boston, drifted across Virginia plantations, and slid quietly into the ear of the Crown. The American Revolution as we know it is a story draped in symbols, flags, declarations, and famous names carved into marble. But beneath that familiar surface lies a deeper, darker story. A story of espionage networks hidden in plain sight, of betrayals committed for gold and for survival, of quiet men and women whose names we never learned, yet whose choices altered the fate of a continent. The year was 1763. The French and Indian War had just ended, and the British Empire stood supreme in North America. Yet that victory came at a crushing cost, a war debt so vast it reached across the Atlantic and landed squarely on the shoulders of the colonists. For years, Americans had lived under a distant crown, loyal in name but independent in habit. Now that crown demanded revenue. The Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the Tea Act, laws written in London, enforced by soldiers whose boots scraped the cobblestones of Boston and New York. But the story you've heard, the one in which patriots simply grew tired of taxes, is too neat. Beneath the surface, secret societies like the Sons of Liberty spread messages in coded broadsheets and invisible ink. British merchants, bound to the crown, quietly smuggled gunpowder to rebel militias in exchange for hard coin. And a shadow war began, one that would simmer for more than a decade before exploding into full revolt. Samuel Adams was not the firebrand history remembers, at least not at first. He was a failed tax collector, a man who'd lost his inheritance and carried a reputation as an agitator. Yet Adams understood the power of narrative. In the early 1770s, he orchestrated what some would now call propaganda campaigns. He would take minor skirmishes and amplify them, framing British soldiers as brutes. After the Boston Massacre in 1770, it was Adams who ensured that Paul Revere's infamous engraving, depicting redcoats firing into a defenseless crowd, spread like wildfire across the colonies. Few knew that Revere's image was exaggerated, even falsified. But that didn't matter. It fueled outrage, and outrage was a spark. Yet even as Adams played his dangerous game, others maneuvered in deeper shadows.
Few today remember Dr. Benjamin Church, Boston's celebrated physician and patriot. He attended secret meetings of the rebel committees, wrote essays condemning British oppression, and earned the trust of men like Adams and John Hancock. But Church carried another identity, that of a British spy. He would pass detailed reports on colonial strategy to General Thomas Gage, the British commander in Boston, for years. Church's betrayal would not be discovered until 1775. By then, untold secrets of the rebellion's earliest days were already in enemy hands. In London, the American colonies were seen as valuable but expendable. King George III's ministers believed that force would quell dissent quickly. They underestimated not only the colonists' anger, but also their networks of intelligence. Spies worked in both directions, and some of the most effective American agents were women. Merchants' wives, tavern keepers, and even household servants gathered information from careless British officers and passed it along through secret channels. One of the earliest and most effective was a young woman named Lydia Dara, a quiet Quaker from Philadelphia. In December of 1777, British officers commandeered her home to hold a private meeting. Dara pretended to sleep as they plotted a surprise attack against General Washington's army at White Marsh. That night, she slipped out of the city under the guise of buying flour and carried the intelligence to American lines. The attack never happened. Lives were saved. And yet Dara's story, like so many others, would fade into obscurity. But not all whispers worked in the Patriots' favor. British commanders cultivated their own network of loyalist spies. Families were torn apart, neighbors turned on one another. A shopkeeper in New York might sell flour to both sides by day and report rebel movements by night. A farmer in New Jersey might hide Continental soldiers in his barn, only to later betray them for a bounty. This was a civil war as much as a revolution, and the most dangerous battles often took place in back rooms and locked attics.
The night of April 18, 1775, was heavy with fog and fear. In Boston, General Thomas Gage, commander of the British forces, had grown weary of the Patriots' resistance. He sent his soldiers marching quietly into the countryside with a single mission: to seize the hidden stockpiles of colonial arms stored in Concord, Massachusetts, and, if possible, to capture two key agitators, Samuel Adams and John Hancock. But the British never expected how quickly the countryside would awaken. Lanterns flashed in church towers, riders bolted down dirt roads, and farmers, roused from their beds, grabbed muskets and powder horns. History remembers Paul Revere's famous ride, but what's rarely told is that dozens of messengers, some of them nameless even today, risked their lives to spread the alarm. Revere himself was captured by British forces before reaching Concord. The warning was carried forward by others like William Dawes and Samuel Prescott, men who rode through the night on nearly exhausted horses. By dawn, the first shots had been fired at Lexington Green. No one knows who pulled the trigger that unleashed the revolution. British soldiers faced off against a ragtag group of militiamen, and in a single chaotic moment, the fragile peace shattered. 8 colonists lay dead. The British pushed forward, but in Concord, they were met by hundreds more armed farmers and tradesmen. Gunfire erupted at the Old North Bridge, and British soldiers soon found themselves retreating under relentless fire from behind stone walls and forest cover. The battles of Lexington and Concord marked the beginning of open war, but they also marked the birth of America's first organized intelligence network. George Washington, a man who had already witnessed the value of espionage during the French and Indian War, understood that victory would not be won by sheer firepower alone. The British Army was the most powerful in the world. The Continental Army, in comparison, was poorly trained, poorly supplied, and constantly on the brink of collapse. Washington needed information, and he needed it desperately. Enter the secret world of codes, dead drops, and double agents. Washington began cultivating spies in every major city the British occupied, but New York City would become the crown jewel of this shadow war. When the British seized New York in the fall of 1776, they turned it into their command hub. Washington needed eyes inside the city, and so the first iteration of the Culper Spy Ring was born. This network was unlike anything the colonies had ever attempted. Operatives used elaborate ciphers and invisible ink made from a mixture of tannic acid and iron salts. They hid messages inside barrels, baked them into loaves of bread, and buried them in secret caches. Their success depended on absolute trust and anonymity. Members rarely knew one another's true identities, and Washington himself referred to them only by code names. But the early days were fraught with missteps. One of the most heartbreaking involved Nathan Hale, a young schoolteacher turned soldier who volunteered to spy behind enemy lines in New York. Hale was brave but inexperienced. Within days of crossing into British territory, he was captured. General William Howe, the British commander, wasted no time in making an example of him. On September 22, 1776, Nathan Hale was hanged. His final words, remembered and immortalized, were said to be, "I only regret that I have but one life to lose for my country." But behind that line of courage was a bitter reality. Hale's failure nearly crippled Washington's intelligence efforts before they had even begun. Washington, however, refused to abandon the spy game. He reorganized his network with greater caution and sophistication. One of his most valuable agents became known only as Agent 355, a mysterious woman whose identity remains a subject of debate even now. She moved in elite loyalist circles in New York City and passed critical information to the Patriots.
Some historians believe she helped expose Benedict Arnold's treason.
Others suggest she died aboard a British prison ship before the war's end. Her true name and the full extent of her deeds was lost to history. Espionage wasn't the only untold dimension of the war. Secret diplomacy played an equally vital role. As American soldiers shivered through the winter at Valley Forge in 1777-78, emissaries were quietly working in Europe to secure alliances and funding. Benjamin Franklin, with his wit and charm, became the unlikely face of the revolution in France. What many don't know is that Franklin also ran his own intelligence network abroad, using personal contacts and informants to monitor British troop movements and political plans. Franklin's greatest success was convincing France to openly support the American cause after the victory at Saratoga. But that alliance came at a cost, a web of competing agendas and secret promises that would shape the new nation's future in ways the colonists could scarcely imagine. France sought revenge against Britain more than it sought liberty for America. Spain, too, joined the war, hoping to reclaim territories lost decades earlier. Back in the colonies, betrayal was a constant threat. Washington's army was filled with men whose loyalties could shift with the tides of war. Few embodied this danger more than Benedict Arnold. A decorated hero at Saratoga, Arnold felt overlooked and underappreciated by Congress. British agents saw his growing resentment and offered him wealth and power in exchange for treason. In 1780, Arnold's betrayal came within inches of handing the key American stronghold at West Point to the British. His contact, Major John André, was captured with incriminating documents hidden in his boot. Arnold escaped across enemy lines, but André was hanged as a spy. The plot's failure saved the revolution from a devastating blow, yet the incident left Washington shaken. It was a reminder that even those closest to him could harbor dangerous secrets. The British, for their part, underestimated the Patriots' ability to wage war in unconventional ways. Guerrilla fighters like Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox of South Carolina, harassed British supply lines and vanished into the wetlands before they could be caught. Small bands of militia ambushed redcoats in the dead of night, blending into the forests that had long been their homes. Yet for all their cunning, the Americans faced near starvation and despair at multiple points. In the winter of 1777 at Valley Forge, men wrapped rags around their bleeding feet for lack of shoes. Disease and hunger cut down soldiers faster than bullets. But even then, Washington was planning. He introduced new training under the Prussian officer, Baron von Steuben, transforming his ragged army into a disciplined fighting force. What kept the revolution alive through such suffering? Part of it was leadership, part of it was sheer desperation, but a great deal of it came from the silent victories of those whose names rarely appear in textbooks. The spies who fed Washington critical information, the merchants who risked everything to smuggle supplies, the enslaved men and women who escaped to fight for whichever side offered a chance at freedom. As the war entered its later years, the lines between patriot and traitor blurred even further. For some, allegiance shifted with the prospect of survival. For others, the revolution's lofty ideals of liberty rang hollow, especially for Native American nations and enslaved Africans, who found themselves pawns in a conflict that offered little for their future. The revolution, for all its glory, was not a story of perfect unity. It was a story of factions, rivalries, and backroom deals, and those untold truths would shape the final years of the conflict in ways few Americans understand today.
The year was 1778, and the war had settled into a grim stalemate. British forces held New York City and other key ports, while Washington's army, though disciplined now, remained chronically undersupplied. Each victory seemed balanced by crushing setbacks. But even as cannons thundered across battlefields, another war was unfolding quietly. One fought in Europe's royal courts, on the high seas, and in the whispers of double agents. France's entry into the war after the American victory at Saratoga changed everything. For the first time, Britain faced not just a rebellion in its colonies, but a global conflict. French warships patrolled the Caribbean and Atlantic, threatening British trade routes. The Spanish, though reluctant at first, soon joined the fray, eager to recover territories lost decades earlier. Even the Dutch Republic, long a British ally, began to lean toward supporting the Americans with loans and arms. Benjamin Franklin, ever the master diplomat, maneuvered expertly through this shifting landscape. In Paris, he charmed the French court with his wit and rustic American image, securing crucial financial and military aid. But Franklin's mission was far more dangerous than history books often suggest. French politics were treacherous, and spies from Britain lurked in every salon. Franklin's letters were frequently intercepted, his movements tracked, and even his household staff in Passy suspected of leaking information. One of the most remarkable but untold episodes of the Revolution took place on the oceans. American privateers, essentially legalized pirates, attacked British merchant ships with ruthless efficiency, capturing cargoes that would be sold to fund the war. These seafaring raiders, captained by men like John Paul Jones, not only disrupted Britain's economy, but also struck fear into its populace. Jones, commanding the Bonhomme Richard, became a legend after his 1779 battle against the British warship Serapis off the coast of England. With his own ship ablaze and sinking, Jones refused to surrender. His reported words, "I have not yet begun to fight," have echoed through history. But what is often left out is the brutal reality of that night. Bodies piled on both decks, blood ran across the planks, and Jones's eventual victory came at a staggering cost. While naval warfare raged, Washington faced another set of challenges closer to home. His Continental Army remained perpetually short on food, weapons, and pay. Soldiers deserted by the hundreds, their faith in the cause wavering as the winter of 1778-79 set in. Washington knew that to survive, he would have to keep one step ahead of the British, and that meant relying more than ever on his intelligence networks.
The Culper Spy Ring, now fully operational, became Washington's lifeline. Operating primarily in and around New York City, its members used secret codes, invisible ink, and dead drops to gather information on British troop movements and plans. One of their greatest coups came in uncovering a plot by the British to counterfeit continental currency, an operation designed to collapse the fragile American economy. But espionage was a two-edged sword. British intelligence was just as active, planting false information and cultivating informants among the patriots. At times, Washington found himself unsure of who to trust. Even Congress, plagued by internal rivalries, often undermined his authority, sending mixed signals to allies abroad and mismanaging supplies at home. In the South, the war took a brutal new turn. British General Charles Cornwallis launched a campaign through the Carolinas and Georgia, hoping to rally loyalists and crush the rebellion's heartland. The fighting there was savage, marked by atrocities on both sides. Guerrilla leaders like Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, struck British detachments in the swamps of South Carolina, vanishing before they could be caught. Loyalist militias retaliated with equal ferocity, burning farms and executing captured rebels. Amid this chaos, enslaved Africans were often forced to choose between two oppressive masters. The British promised freedom to any enslaved person who escaped and joined their forces, while some patriot leaders made similar offers in desperation. Thousands fled plantations in search of liberty, yet many would find themselves betrayed or abandoned once their usefulness ended. Native American nations, too, were drawn into the conflict, often with devastating consequences. Some tribes sided with the British, hoping to halt colonial expansion into their lands. Others allied with the Americans, seeking to protect their homes. But regardless of allegiance, many Native communities were destroyed in retaliatory raids. Washington himself ordered scorched earth campaigns against the Iroquois Confederacy in 1779, an episode that remains one of the darkest chapters of the Revolution. As the war dragged on, fatigue and despair spread on all sides. Yet amidst the bloodshed, glimmers of hope emerged. In 1781, French forces under General Rochambeau joined Washington for a bold campaign in Virginia. Their combined armies marched south, while French warships under Admiral de Grasse sailed to blockade British reinforcements. The stage was set for the decisive confrontation of the war, Yorktown. But before cannons roared and trenches were dug, Washington's spies delivered a final, crucial advantage. Through the Culper Ring, he learned that the British believed he planned to attack New York. Washington encouraged this misconception, feeding the enemy false information. Cornwallis, lulled into a false sense of security, fortified his position at Yorktown, unaware that he was walking into a trap.
October 1781. The war had dragged on for 6 long years, leaving a trail of devastation across the American colonies. Farms burned, cities occupied, families fractured. Washington knew that without a decisive victory, the revolution could not endure much longer. Morale was low, and the Continental Congress was nearly bankrupt. Yet in the face of despair, the American commander plotted the boldest move of the war. The British expected Washington to strike New York, where General Clinton's army was entrenched. Instead, he marched south. The deception was masterful. The Culper Spy Ring fed false intelligence to Clinton, convincing him that New York was the target. By the time Clinton realized the truth, it was too late. Washington and French General Rochambeau had already reached Virginia, uniting with the Marquis de Lafayette's forces to trap Cornwallis at the small coastal town of Yorktown. But Washington's plan hinged on one critical factor: control of the sea. The French fleet under Admiral de Grasse had to arrive in time to block British reinforcements. If the Royal Navy broke through, Cornwallis could escape or be resupplied, and the campaign would collapse. On September 5, 1781, the Battle of the Chesapeake decided the fate of the Revolution. The French Navy fought fiercely, driving the British fleet back to New York. Cornwallis was now trapped, cut off from escape by sea, and surrounded on land by a combined force of over 17,000 American and French troops. Washington wasted no time. He ordered siege lines dug around Yorktown, cannons hauled into position under the cover of night. Day by day, the noose tightened. The bombardment was relentless, reducing British defenses to rubble. Cornwallis's men, huddled in trenches, endured a constant rain of shot and shell. Food supplies dwindled, disease spread, and hope slipped away. One of the most daring moments of the siege came on night of October 14, when Washington ordered assaults on 2 key British redoubts. The American attack on Redoubt 10 was led by Alexander Hamilton, who had long sought a chance to prove himself in battle. Charging through musket fire and bayonets, Hamilton's men captured the position in minutes, using only their bayonets to maintain the element of surprise. The French seized Redoubt 9 at the same time, sealing Cornwallis's fate. By October 17, the British commander had no choice but to surrender. Cornwallis, claiming illness, sent his second-in-command to formally hand over arms.
In a solemn ceremony, British soldiers marched out of Yorktown and stacked their muskets as a band played a tune reportedly called "The World Turned Upside Down." For Washington, the victory was both triumphant and sobering. He knew the war was not yet over. The British still held New York, Charleston, and Savannah, but Yorktown had broken the Empire's will. In London, public support for the conflict evaporated. Negotiations began, and within 2 years, the Treaty of Paris would formally recognize the United States of America as an independent nation.
Yet even as the revolution drew to a close, its untold secrets continued to shape the outcome. Washington's intelligence networks remained active, ensuring that peace negotiations were not undermined by British intrigues. The Culper Ring, which had operated in complete secrecy for years, quietly dissolved, its members returning to ordinary lives. Their identities would not be fully revealed until well into the 20th century. But the war's ending was not a happy one for all. Tens of thousands of loyalists, Americans who had sided with the Crown, fled their homes, fearing retribution. Many resettled in Canada or the Caribbean, their property confiscated and their communities shattered. Enslaved Africans who had fought for British promises of freedom were often abandoned, left to be re-enslaved or forced into exile. Native American nations who had supported the British found themselves isolated and vulnerable as the new United States expanded westward. The Revolution had birthed a nation, but it had also left deep scars. And in the years to come, the secrets and compromises made in its final chapters would resurface in ways no one could have foreseen.
The cannons had fallen silent at Yorktown, but peace did not come overnight. Washington knew that the victory, as monumental as it was, had only secured leverage at the negotiating table. British troops still occupied key cities, and the Empire's naval supremacy meant they could strike again if negotiations failed. The revolution hung in a fragile balance, and behind closed doors, new battles were fought, not with muskets, but with words, concessions, and secrets few would ever know. The Treaty of Paris negotiations of 1782 and 1783 were as tense and treacherous as any battlefield. The Americans, led by Franklin, Jay, and Adams, were determined to secure full independence and favorable borders. But they were not the only players. France, whose aid had been indispensable, had its own ambitions to weaken Britain but not allow America to grow too powerful. Spain, allied with France, sought control of territories along the Mississippi and in Florida. John Jay, wary of French duplicity, secretly opened back-channel talks with the British, bypassing America's allies. Franklin, though outwardly cordial, also maneuvered quietly to ensure that American interests came first. These secret negotiations shocked and angered the French, but they worked. On September 3, 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. Britain recognized the independence of the United States, ceded territory stretching to the Mississippi River, and granted fishing rights off the coast of Newfoundland. Yet the victory came with compromises. Loyalists, many of whom had fought alongside the British, were supposed to be protected from retribution and allowed to reclaim confiscated property. In reality, many were harassed, their homes seized or burned. Thousands fled north to Canada or across the Atlantic, leaving behind the lives they had built. The fate of enslaved Africans was another dark shadow over the new republic. During the war, the British had promised freedom to those who escaped Patriot masters and joined their cause. When the war ended, thousands were left stranded. Some were evacuated to Canada or the Caribbean, but many were betrayed and re-enslaved. Even in the North, where gradual emancipation began, freedom often came at a cruel cost. Families separated, children sold away. For Native American nations, the treaty was nothing short of catastrophic. They had not been represented in Paris, yet the lands they had inhabited for centuries were carved up as bargaining chips. Many tribes had fought alongside the British in the hope of halting colonial expansion. Now they found themselves facing a new and even more relentless wave of settlers, backed by a government eager to claim the western frontier. The Revolution's lofty ideals of liberty and equality had inspired millions, but its reality was far more complicated. Washington himself was haunted by the contradictions. He had led a nation in the fight for freedom, yet he owned enslaved people.
He believed the new republic must be united and stable, but deep divisions, political, economic, and moral, already threatened its foundations. In December 1783, Washington stunned the world when he resigned his commission as commander-in-chief and returned to private life. Kings and generals rarely surrendered power voluntarily, and his act set a precedent that would define American democracy. But Washington's departure was not simply symbolic. He understood the fragility of the new nation and the dangers of concentrating authority in a single figure. Meanwhile, the men who had served under him struggled to survive in the fledgling republic. Veterans often returned home to find their farms in ruin, their families impoverished. Many had not been paid for years of service, and Congress, bankrupt and disorganized, could offer little relief. Discontent simmered, and in 1786, it would erupt in Shays' Rebellion, a farmers' uprising in Massachusetts that exposed just how unstable the Union truly was. The birth of the United States was celebrated with parades and proclamations, but beneath the surface lay silent sacrifices and unresolved conflicts. Women who had managed households, run businesses, and even fought in disguise during the war were pushed back into traditional roles, their contributions largely forgotten. Indigenous nations faced dispossession and destruction. Enslaved Africans remained in bondage, their hopes for freedom deferred for generations. And yet the revolution had planted seeds that would grow in ways even its leaders could not have imagined. The language of liberty and equality, imperfectly applied though it was, would inspire future generations to demand a fuller realization of those ideals. The American Revolution was not the clean, unified struggle it is often remembered as. It was messy, filled with betrayal, compromise, and quiet heroism. It was a story not only of great leaders, but of ordinary people, farmers, soldiers, merchants, enslaved laborers, and spies, whose choices, sacrifices, and secrets shaped the nation's destiny.
The dust of war had barely settled when the questions began. What kind of nation would the United States become? What lessons would it carry forward from its long, bitter struggle? And which truths would be quietly swept under the rug, buried in the folds of patriotic legend? The revolution left behind more than independence. It created a mythology, one that celebrated heroism and unity, often at the expense of complexity. The famous names, Washington, Franklin, Adams, Jefferson, stood as towering figures in the new nation's story. But for every celebrated founder, there were countless unsung individuals whose contributions remained in the shadows. The members of the Culper Spy Ring, for instance, who had risked their lives to feed Washington vital intelligence, lived and died largely unknown. Their identities were kept so secret that not even the general knew many of their true names. For nearly 150 years, historians could only guess who had carried messages across enemy lines, who had buried coded letters in farm fields, who had quietly altered the outcome of battles from behind enemy lines. One of the most enduring mysteries was that of Agent 355, the elusive female operative who moved within Loyalist circles in New York City. Some believe she was captured and perished on a British prison ship, her name forever erased from history. Others suspect she survived and simply slipped back into civilian life. Whatever the truth, her story, and the stories of countless other women, was lost in a narrative dominated by men. But secrets were not confined to espionage. The revolution's ideals had promised freedom and equality, yet entire populations were excluded. The contradiction of slavery haunted the new republic. Enslaved Africans who had fought on either side of the war often found themselves returned to bondage. Native American nations, who had hoped to preserve their homelands by siding with the British, faced devastating land seizures as the United States expanded westward. For many Loyalists, life after the Revolution was equally bleak. Branded as traitors, tens of thousands fled to new nation, their property confiscated. Some found refuge in Canada or the Caribbean, but the scars of exile never fully healed. These were Americans too, yet their stories were largely erased from the triumphalist narrative. And then there were the political compromises that would shape the nation's future for generations. The Articles of Confederation, America's first attempt at a national government, were weak by design, giving most power to the states. The result was chaos, interstate rivalries, economic disarray, and uprisings like Shays' Rebellion.
The framers of the Constitution would later strengthen federal authority, but at the cost of deep, bitter debates. Debates over slavery, representation, and the balance of power that would simmer for decades. The legacy of the American Revolution is as complicated as the conflict itself. It birthed a nation founded on radical ideals, yet it also left behind unfinished business and unresolved contradictions. The freedom it promised was not universal. The equality it declared was imperfect. But its impact was undeniable. Revolutions erupted in France, Haiti, and across Latin America, inspired by the idea that ordinary people could overthrow empires. The language of liberty became a rallying cry for movements to abolish slavery, secure women's rights, and demand civil liberties. Still, many of the revolution's secrets remain buried. Letters and journals lost to time, lives erased by anonymity, battles fought in the shadows, invisible to history. The revolution was not only a war of muskets and cannons, it was a war of ideas, of intelligence, of survival. The American Revolution was not the clean, unified fight that patriotic myth would later suggest. It was a messy, human struggle, one shaped as much by quiet sacrifices and clandestine acts as by grand declarations and famous victories. Its true story lives not only in the halls of Congress or on the pages of history books, but in the forgotten letters, unmarked graves, and whispered memories of those who fought, spied, and endured. And perhaps that is the greatest untold secret of all, that the revolution, for all its flaws and failures, was carried forward by countless ordinary people, people whose names we may never know, but whose choices shaped the destiny of a nation.